At the end of July 1945, Japan stood alone, and the Allies were diverting their considerable resources from the European sphere to the Pacific. Tokyo had been incendiary bombed to a moonscape, and a city that once housed 7 million was now the home to just 200,000 essential workers. MacArthur had indeed returned to the Philippines. Borneo was about to be next. The Little Boy bomb was in its final stages for preparations on the Marianas. Once the equals of the mighty US Navy Pacific Fleet, the Japanese Navy had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self, was largely now a coastal force under constant threat from the air. This situation was best exemplified by the heavy cruisers, the Takaro and Mayoko. These two had been at the pointy end of the war, literally from Pearl Harbor till July 1945. Leyte, the Aleutian Islands, Guadalcanal, Truk, Rabaul. Both were now disabled due to torpedo attack and lay in separate locations in Singapore with no prospect of repair, short of being towed to Japan, which even the Naval Command deemed a suicide mission. Concealed under camouflaged netting in Singapore Harbour, their new strategic roles were as floating anti-aircraft platforms. It was in Singapore Britain suffered their greatest military defeat 3 years earlier. It was time to reclaim Singapore and the Malaysian Peninsula. Just days before Enola Gay and Boxcar took off on their mission, the British looked to take out both the Takaro and the Mayoko and destroy communication lines around the region with Japan, using midget submarines they called XEs. In December 1941, the British Navy found out the hard way how effective mini-subs in the form of human torpedoes could be, when the Italians caused serious damage to two battleships, the Valiant and the Queen Elizabeth, in Alexandria Harbour. 6 months later, Sydneysiders had the war at their doorsteps when 3 Japanese 2-man midget submarines penetrated Sydney Harbour, sinking 1 vessel and killing 21. Not that the British were late off the rank with their own Chariot-type human torpedoes and mini-subs they dubbed X-craft. As the war progressed, so did the development of midget submarines. And this took place in secret in the Firth of Clyde, Scotland. These subs were carried on top or towed behind a mothership submarine and then released close to the target, recovered in the same fashion. To be effective, the sub would need to manoeuvre close to the target, and then divers would be released to attach mines before returning to the sub and scarper before the mines detonated. Later on in the war, they also carried 2 2-ton explosive charges on each side, which were released under the target, all whilst trying to avoid detection and with that almost certain elimination. The epoch of the British X-craft took place in a Norwegian fjord in September 1943. 6 XE craft were assigned the mission to attack the German battleship the Tirpitz. XEs, initially carried by 6 mother submarines, snuck in and critically damaged the battleship Tirpitz. They paid a hefty price. 2 of the subs never made it to Norway after becoming unhitched from the subs that was towing them. Another was discovered by the Germans and sunk, and a 4th suffered engine problems. Only XE6 and XE7 got to complete the mission. 10 were killed and 6 captured. If you really want to see a good movie about what was called Operation Source, that's the sinking of the Tirpitz, take a look at Above Us the Waves. No, you don't have to stop watching this video to see if it's on YouTube. It is. Per head, those that entered the submarine service on all sides suffered the highest casualty rates, particularly if you were in a U-boat. 75% of those submariners ended up in iron coffins at the bottom of the Atlantic. Peel back those figures, and those assigned into a mini-sub had even less chance of survival. And X-craft were no different. At particular risk were the divers that exited the vessel to attach the mines. In total, 20 X-craft were built, of which just one remains today. Here's some footage of one scooting along. They were around 6 metres long and 1.7 metres wide and crewed by 4. These cross sections give you a better look at the interior layout. XEs were powered in the same fashion as their bigger cousins, propelled by a 42 horse diesel on the surface and a 30 horse powered electric motor submerged. That video made them look rather sprightly on the surface. They weren't. 12 kilometres an hour full tit, less under the surface. One thing they did have was endurance. On the surface, an impressive 1,000 kilometres. Smith was born in Gore into what would now be called a single-parent family. At 17 and now living in Christchurch, he and a mate decided over a few beers they wanted to go forth into the world by joining the navies as reservists. Only the recruiting officer quickly picked up they were both pissed and suggested they review their decision when the booze had worn off. Go to sea he did at the beginning of World War II, ending up in the UK on board the 1,600 crewed battleship HMS Duke of York, with one of the most unenviable jobs one could imagine, up the crow's nest. By 1943 he was reassigned to training and testing craft in development up in Scotland. One of those were X-craft or XEs. By the beginning of 1945, Smith was the first lieutenant of XE6, As the war in Europe closed and the attention shifted to the Pacific, it was decided to transfer 6 of the midgets to Australia on the deck of a specialist submarine transfer supply vessel, the Bonaventure, awaiting missions against the Japanese they were designed for. In early 1945, 6 XEs were now in Brisbane. Smith was assigned to command XE6. In training exercises, 2 of that sub's divers drowned, and effectively that sub was sidelined due to lack of crew. He was then placed in XE3 under Ian Fraser. The XE project was very much a Commonwealth affair. 2 missions were now on the table. One revolved around tackling the Japanese underwater cables they relied on to communicate regionally. The Allies by now were regularly decrypting radio communications. That was in no small part down to the 2 crews of 2 New Zealand minesweepers. If you want to learn more about that, take a look at the video on your screen. Link in the description. Communications entirely over the airwaves would bring about obvious benefits. XE4 was assigned to cut the cable running between Hong Kong and Saigon. XE5 had a similar task, only they were given the cable between Singapore and Hong Kong. Then there was the more perilous mission to enter Singapore Harbour and sink both the Japanese cruisers anchored there. XE1, the Myoko under John Smart, XE3, the Takaro. The first to go was XE4 on the 31st of July. The midget was towed to within 60 kilometres of their target on the bottom of the ocean near the Mekong Delta, and 2 divers were tasked with the gnarly bit, the severing. 3 days later, XE5 was doing the same job near Hong Kong, again with 2 divers due to the depth. Both missions were successful, and the crews all made it back safe. Next up, the Johor Straits. With it, harbour patrols, minefields, underwater listening posts, shoreline gunnery posts, and defensive buoys. Both subs had crews that had survived the Tirpitz mission, be it in submarines that had mechanical issues. On the afternoon of the 31st of July, they were released from the lines towing them close to the entrance of the strait and tentatively motored up the harbour, preferring to risk a route littered with mines as opposed to closer to the shore where detection was more likely. Now daylight, it had taken 11 hours for both craft to cover 60 kilometres, and fortune was favouring them, fortune that would stick with them. XE3 with Smith at the control was forced to crash dive and sit it out on the bottom after a tanker under escort bore down on them. That emergency dive was executed in such a rushed fashion to avoid being mowed down. Some of the navigation equipment was damaged when it struck the bottom at just 12 metres. Even though the subs had been especially refitted for their new environment under the water, the small subs were effectively saunas. One thing they did have was a small fridge loaded with orange juice, plus a good stock of amphetamines to keep them awake and alert. So it wasn't just the Germans that used them. Smith occupied his time and calmed his nerve, resting on the bottom, by knitting. When they nervously resurfaced, they rose straight up onto a mine, which fortuitously didn't detonate, otherwise you wouldn't be hearing this. Reunited, they both found the anti-submarine boom open and glided into the harbour around midday. Fraser and XE3 soon found the Takaro submerged and began their attack around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At this point, XE3 had been under the waves for 9 hours of the 19. Her attack was two-pronged. Their diver from Northern Ireland, James McInnes, would attach the limpets, and then the sub would navigate directly below the vessel and detach its 2 giant explosive charges. XE1 wasn't having as much luck. They had failed to locate the Maioku. That cruiser was another 4 kilometres down the harbour, and patrol boats in that stretch of the water were aplenty. Captain Smart decided not to pursue the original target, but wait for XE3 to drop and detach their explosive under the Tikaro, then quickly scoot in and drop their 2 giant 2-tonners below her, just for good measure. Back in the X3, in a feat of incredible seamanship, Fraser made his way into the hollow below the giant vessel, all but blind given his navigation equipment had been damaged. Not that the run went entirely to plan. The sub was now positioned so close to midships their diver had trouble even opening the diver's hatch. Outside, McInnes discovered the limpet mines were proving impossible to attach due to the crustaceans lining the hull. Removing them would first take time, and his scuba gear had developed a leak, meaning it would be spotted on the surface. Meanwhile, the tide was going out, which risked trapping the sub. In a piece of bravery which earned McInnes a Victoria Cross, the limpets were finally in place. Next, the larger mines that were attached to the ship's sides. By now, the Tikaro was even lower in the water, and after dropping the port mine, the XE3 now found itself wedged under the cruiser. Nor could the affixed port mine be released without someone going outside and taking literally a heavy wrench to it. An hour after first being pinned under the Tikaro, XE3 was able to extradite itself thanks largely to Smith. The exhausted McInnes ventured outside for a second time and finally freed the second mine. The XE3 left the scene for the relative safety of the outer harbour. Next up, XE1, who went hanging around. They dropped their heavy mines and retreated to a safe distance to watch the fireworks display at 9:30 that night, 30 hours odd into their mission. The massive explosions tore a 20 by 10 metre hole in the Tikaro's hull. That damage was terminal. A day after XE1 and XE3 rendezvoused with their mother subs, this happened. The Herculean efforts of all 4 midget subs were somewhat eclipsed. And Captain Fraser also went on to win a Victoria Cross, Smith a Distinguished Service Order, and the other seamen on board the XE3, Alfred Reed, a conspicuous gallantry medal. The crews of XE1, XE4 and XE5 were also recognised, as were 4 of those involved in the transportation of the subs to their dispatch and retrieval points. Smith can probably feel a bit stiff missing out on a VC. All the other blokes as well. After the war, Smith continued his career with the New Zealand Navy, rising to the rank of commander, even assisting the surveying of the site where New Zealand's base at the South Pole sits today. The building that now houses the maritime operations for the New Zealand Navy is now named after him. We truly have a lot to thank people of his mettle for. This has been a long one, so thanks for sticking with it. I get great feedback about my Kiwi World War videos, which I really appreciate. My favourite is this one, and I'm working on a sequel. Rest assured I'll be doing more war history videos, so subscribe if you haven't already. I will spot you next time. Bye for now.